Would you pray with me? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Over these last few weeks, I've shared a couple of basic spiritual practices that I hope are helpful, especially in this time when we cannot gather in person. We've always known that what we do Sundays at 10 a.m. is just one small expression of our faith. But in this season when we cannot be together in the ways in which we are accustomed, we're reminded of the importance of tending to our spiritual lives on a daily basis. In this time in which our familiar routines, habits, and practices have been disrupted, it's even more important to find ways to connect with God outside of corporate worship, in our homes and in our hearts. My hope is that these practices might help you do that. For some of us, these practices might be familiar already, part of an existing personal devotion time. But for others, a daily devotion time has rarely, if ever, been part of our normal schedules. So these practices might be new and even a little strange. And of course, there is no one right way to encounter God. And I encourage you to find the habits and rituals that speak to you. But at the same time, I encourage you to stretch yourself a bit. Be willing to give something new a try and see what you experience. You might be pleasantly surprised to discover new ways of listening for God and sensing God's presence. This week, the practice I want to share with you is silence. Silence, solitude, and stillness are connected practices that are mentioned throughout our Holy Scriptures and have been part of our Christian tradition across the centuries. In Psalm 46, God's voice says, "Be still and know that I am God." And in Psalm 62, the psalmist sings, "For God alone my soul waits in silence, for my hope is from God." In today's text from 1 Kings, we hear about the prophet Elijah's experiences with solitude and with silence. Jesus spent time in silence and solitude. At the beginning of his ministry, we hear he went into the wilderness for 40 days and nights. And in Mark's gospel, we hear that Jesus went to a deserted place where he could be alone in prayer. In the book of Acts and in the early letters of the church, the apostle Peter regularly withdrew for times of silence and prayer. Paul spent 3 years alone with God before starting his ministry. And John spent the end of his life alone in exile on the island of Patmos. Some of the earliest followers of Christ, the desert fathers and mothers, monks and nuns from the 3rd century, retreated out into the Egyptian desert for solitude and silence. And from medieval mystics right up to the spiritual leaders of today, silence and solitude remain part of our Christian practice. But for many of us, silence and solitude are not things we seek out willingly. We might even find we have an aversion to them. In his book, Keeping Silence, Episcopal priest C.W. McPherson acknowledges that silence is difficult for many of us, and he names some of the reasons why. In some ways, silence is connected to death, which is not a topic most of us are eager to explore. Silence and solitude can also be equated with punishment or even torture, from the go sit in the corner discipline some of us received as children, to the prisoner who's placed in solitary confinement. McPherson also notes that in contemporary society, we equate noise with freedom and pleasure. And the current noise level in our world, he says, is abnormal. But we've become accustomed to its consistency and intensity, and it becomes a sort of insulation for us. Certainly in these days of sheltering in place, some of us are experiencing a break from the noise of our daily routines. Some of us find ourselves with a silence and a solitude we did not choose and do not want. Meanwhile, others of us are embarrassed or even feel guilty that we are enjoying this reprieve from the clamor and commotion of our normal lives. So we know we do not all experience silence and solitude in the same way. But the kind of silence and solitude I want to invite us into is one that we choose, not one that has been forced upon us. Faith leaders from many traditions, along with psychologists and researchers across disciplines, point to the many benefits of silence, including the ways that it improves concentration, calms our bodies, and offers balance in our lives. Entering into silence can help us listen and connect more deeply with ourselves, with the people around us, with nature, and through all that and beyond that, with God. But just as peace is more than the absence of war, so the practice of silence is much more than not talking. Sometimes without realizing it, we can go for long periods of time without speaking, glued to our computers or the television or our cell phones. But this isn't the kind of silence we mean. An intentional practice of silence is one in which we attempt to let go of the distractions that consume us and to quiet our minds so that we might attend more fully to God's presence in our lives. The word in Hebrew from Psalm 46 that we often hear as "be still" is actually something more like "let go" or "relax." And it evokes this image of slackening your shoulders and letting your arms hang by your sides. So one writer translates Psalm 46 this way: "Let go of your concerns, then you will know that I am God." Now, there are many ways to practice silence, and I'll include some links with suggestions in the transcript that accompanies this video in your Worship from Home resources. In Keeping Silence, the book, C.W. McPherson recommends starting, quite simply, with 10 minutes in silence alone, insulated from distractions, sitting somewhere comfortable. And he suggests as you do that, make notes about how it feels. What feels difficult, awkward, even silly? What feels good, peaceful, relaxing? And if sitting alone doesn't call to you, there are other ways to encounter silence. Walking meditation is one, or sharing a meal in silence together is another. But what all of these ways of practicing silence have in common is that they all invite us to slow down, to let go, and to pay attention, to notice what surfaces when we turn down the noise. When we are silent, we might notice the actual sounds that are always in the background, but that escape our attention much of the time. The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of birds chirping, the gurgle of our own stomachs when we're hungry. But we'll also notice our internal noise as well. When we try to quiet down, the mental static of what the Buddhists call the monkey mind can be difficult to quiet. It takes time before we can detach enough from all those thoughts to find a quiet place of peace. One suggestion I found helpful is that as you sit in silence and become aware of your thoughts, treat them like clouds in the sky. Notice them, and then allow them to just drift by. Don't attach to them. As we settle into silence, we might notice emotions surface of which we were unaware. In the busyness of our lives, work, family, all our commitments, we can sometimes move at a pace that we don't give ourselves time to really feel things. Or perhaps there are emotions we'd rather not feel, and so we ignore them and push them down when they do come to our awareness. We find the noise of our lives a distraction from pain, and we just keep going. But when we enter into times of silence, with the volume turned down a bit, our inner lives begin to speak more loudly. And so we know that when those emotions surface, we can bring those to God. We can ask God to help heal what needs to be healed, to release us from things we need to release, to help us hold things we need to hold. Whatever is needed, we can trust that God is with us. There is so much we are carrying these days, and there's so much that is unknown. So like the prophet Elijah, we might feel overwhelmed, exhausted, unsure of where to turn next. We might imagine ourselves like him, lying down under a solitary tree. It was there, resting alone, when angels came and fed Elijah. And it was there, after all the noise subsided, that he heard God speak. So, dear ones, when you feel as if you cannot take another step, when your spirits are weary, may you find the space to lie down and rest. May you sense the presence of God's angels feeding your hungry spirits. And in the silence that comes, may you hear the voice of God, reminding you that you are not alone and offering you guidance for the journey ahead. Amen.